Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to my review of Pokemon Legends Arceus. It's rather fitting that this is what finally makes me talk about a Pokemon game. Though I grew up watching the anime and playing the Game Boy games, I tapped out near the start of Gen 4, in part due to shifting interests and in part because my family never bought a DS. Once I was on my own and had a Switch though, it made sense to catch back up with the mainline franchise, after having peeked back through the window with the mobile spin-offs, to find that basically nothing had changed. Sword and Shield ended up being Baby's first Pokemon game, and the Diamond and Pearl remakes ended up being so similar to the originals that I wish I hadn't played Platinum in anticipation of it. Based on that, it would seem that I would end up once again tapping out. But then we come to this game. It wasn't a mainline entry in that we didn't have 8 gym leaders, Team Bad Guy, and an Elite 4+ champion to worry about, but it was still getting a lot of the attention you'd expect from a mainline entry. More to the point, it was taking us to a very different time period in the Pokemon world, and was placing a lot of emphasis on exploration and discovery rather than trainer battles. What kind of effect this would have on the moment-to-moment gameplay wasn't entirely clear though, as either the exploration was so good that it warranted everything else being de-emphasized, or we were about to get a much more threadbare entry that would cement a lot of the negative sentiment toward the franchise. With that in mind, let's see whether the game was able to impress, starting with the gameplay. The majority of your time will be spent out in the wilderness as you study, capture, and battle the Pokemon that live out there, with the goal of filling out the first Pokédex. It's easier to catch them this time around, with the Pokeball animation being a little shorter to account for it, but as a result, filling out a Pokédex entry requires you to do more than just catch them. Depending on the Pokemon, it may require you to see them use a certain move during battle, to catch them in a specific way, or to evolve a certain number of them. You don't have to do every single research task to complete the Pokédex entry, though by the time this review is out, it wouldn't surprise me if someone were crazy enough to try that. My chief concern about the game was how well it would be able to keep this simple premise going, as while there are a lot of unique Pokemon, I was worried that it would grow tedious. Thankfully, they do a fair amount to try and keep you engaged. For one thing, different Pokemon will react differently to your presence, with Bidoof being largely uninterested, Starly fleeing at the first sign of trouble, and Shinx being aggressive. You can theoretically just throw your own Pokemon to simplify the process, but since skittish Pokemon can flee from battle, that's not always a guarantee. This difference in how Pokemon behave is also reflected in the Pokédex entries, with each one receiving slightly different requirements. Shinx, being an aggressive electric type, can have its entry filled out by defeating it with a ground type move, whereas Starly's entry asks you to capture a certain number of them without being spotted, while your starter's entry is almost entirely based around using certain moves. To further add variety, the landscape itself is fairly diverse, which naturally lends itself to Pokemon showing up in different places, such as Ponyta in an open field, and Buizel near rivers and shallow ponds. This also means approaching different Pokemon comes with its own set of challenges, as while grasslands may have an abundance of tall grass for you to hide out in, insert overused I am the Pokemon now joke here, the marshlands have a lot of shallow water which not only slows you down but also prevents you from dodge rolling. Given that dodge rolling is one of very few ways to defend against wild Pokemon, it's no surprise they introduced marshlands in the second area instead of the first. Add on a day-night cycle and weather effects to influence what Pokemon show up, and even when the game asks you to double back to previous locations, there's a nice sense of discovery as you learn where Pokemon can be found and when they show up. This sense of discovery and exploration is the primary reason why there was such a positive reception toward the game shortly after its release, as it seemed like what the wild area in Sword and Shield should have been. Instead of just walking up to a Pokemon and fighting it, you approach each one slightly differently, keeping to the grass to avoid scaring it, throwing out berries or other food to draw it closer, or when all else fails, just meet the aggressive Pokemon head-on with your own. As you continue, you'll also get new tools to help you with this, such as a smoke bomb that allows you to hide in an open area, which becomes essential in rocky areas with a lot of aggressive Pokemon. If you like to live dangerously though, you can carry items that can be thrown at Pokemon to stun them rather than capture them, giving you an opportunity to either flee or capture them without entering a Pokemon battle. They also introduced 2 new types of Pokeballs, one which can't be thrown as far but is more effective if Pokemon are caught unawares, and one that can be thrown from really far away in case you don't have a smoke bomb at the ready or are just feeling lazy. The intended purpose of the latter might be for catching the Pokemon you see flying around every now and then, hence why it's called a Feather Ball, but if it works as a Sniper Ball in that case, there's nothing stopping you from using it as such elsewhere. There's even great and ultra variants of both if you're willing to put in the materials for it, which means even if you use it for the intended purpose, it'll reduce the time you spend trying to capture it. As a result, the game is able to stay engaging throughout the main story, though given it's a pseudo-open world game, the pacing is wildly inconsistent. At the start, there is a metric ton of exposition as the game tries to deliver the tutorial and sell you on the characters and setting at the same time. Once that you get into an open field though, assuming that you've brought or can scavenge enough supplies, you can stay out there for literal hours and never interact with another human being. For the latter, that's more of a conscious choice, as I seldom spent longer than an hour without at least stopping by a base camp, but even though the game mechanics are pretty straightforward, the front-loaded story bits can make it seem like a lot. Whether the exploration will appear overwhelming or not depends on how thorough you want to be. If you're the kind of person who can't help but leave no stone unturned, this game will give you nightmares. Pokemon are constantly spawning in, and there are a ton of materials that can be gathered while you're out there, such as stones that can be used to make Pokeballs, berries to lure Pokemon closer to you, herbs to create healing items, and so on. Sometimes you're able to pick up materials yourself, but usually you have to chuck a Pokemon at it, with that Pokemon getting a bit of experience for its trouble. That aspect means you can be especially lazy with how you gather materials, as if there's something you want down the hill and you don't want to jump down, just throw a Pokemon at it and walk away. The crafting system is also a welcome addition, as it means you spend less time having to run back to a base camp for materials, which is really nice considering how quickly you can burn through potions and Pokeballs. Your limited storage space can be a nuisance on occasion, but from my experience, the base camps are well placed to allow you to deal with it. Every time I was having to dip into my inventory to craft something just to make room for more, there was usually a chance to set up a second base camp just up ahead, so inventory management was seldom an issue. The rapidly increasing cost of extra bag space, and the fact that I had to go through the whole spiel every time I wanted a singular slot weren't exactly pleasant, but that's about my only complaint there. There was also an occasional moment where I didn't have the specific resources to make revives or potions, but considering you're able to buy them and the crafting materials needed for them outright, there are ways to circumvent it, and having those limits can force you to be more careful as to how you proceed. To further influence the pacing and to encourage you to explore further, you'll also receive direct objectives from both the main story as well as requests from the locals. The requests can range from completing the Pokédex entry on a given Pokémon, gathering a certain number of specific materials, or finding a Pokémon that can then be given to someone. They're not something that you desperately need to worry about, and by the time the credits rolled, I still had a metric ton to see to, but if you're ever in need of direction or want an excuse to grind your main team's level, they're a welcome addition. Alternatively, the requests can also help you appreciate how much there still is to explore, as I went very far into the game before I ever saw a Cherim, even with this request taunting me over that fact for most of my playthrough. Then again, having so many built up meant that I had a lot of reason to explore even after the credits rolled, so at the end of the day, I guess I can't complain that much. While I'm on the subject, I may as well say what I mean when I talk about the credits, as there's two main story threads to worry about. One of them pertains to the interactions between the local humans and Pokemon, which is a story that takes somewhere between 15 to 25 hours to complete. The second main thread is your mission to complete the Pokédex, with the quote main story being used to help you find legendary Pokemon. For the initial story, the pacing was set up pretty well, as whenever I had had my fill of aimless exploration or fulfilling requests, I was always at about the right level to take on the next main story challenge. Eventually though, I reached the point where I had seen to everything that the main story had to offer, with the remaining sliver being gated behind completing the Pokédex. Once the game reaches this point, the cracks start to form, as it can start to grow repetitive as the number of tasks at hand start to dwindle. It also becomes annoying as the tasks become more specific, with Pokemon tucked away behind specific locations at specific times of day in specific weather, assuming it's not a super rare Pokemon like Pichu, and assuming you don't have to wait for a wholly random event like these really dangerous space-time distortions to happen just to find Pokemon like Magnemite. There are ways to get around this, such as taking along Pokemon that you need to see use particular moves while also hunting for rarer ones, but by then you'll have built up a couple of strong Pokemon that can be used to steamroll most dangerous encounters, especially since a lot of those encounters will have been taken care of by this point. To the game's credit though, it did take until the 40-hour mark before that started to be an issue, and even then it wasn't a constant issue. Considering my usual disdain for open world elements, the fact that it took this long to start wearing on me is definitely worth commending. To go into more detail, it's been my experience that open world games usually have to sacrifice the game balance in order to create said open world, as allowing you to explore everywhere means you can no longer guarantee when someone will reach a certain challenge. Add on to the fact that a lot of open world games have some kind of progression system, and you can end up with a steep learning curve as you're trying to figure out what your weaker character is capable of. After a while though, once you've gotten your bearings and built up your character or team, it ends up being too easy and overly repetitive, which makes thoroughly exploring the game rather tedious. In this case, however, they managed to partially sidestep it by segmenting the not really an open world into 5 sub-regions, each of which has its own distinct environments and Pokemon. By doing that, there's a base guarantee that you won't run into a level 50 Scyther when all you have is a level 5 Rowlet, with any cases of someone going off the beaten path to find the level 45 Snorlax being an anomaly that you can easily run away from until you're ready. Even within a given sub-region, you'll have sections that are unreachable because the game doesn't allow you to swim or climb until you befriend certain Pokemon, which gives you reason to return to that sub-region later on. There's still the tedious aspect once you've exhausted most of the requests and collectibles and just have to grind out Pokemon encounters, but the initial phase managed to avoid one of the main reasons why I dislike open world elements. Since the combat encounters can eventually make up a large portion of your time, let's talk about what's new there. If you've somehow made it this far and haven't played a Pokemon game, combat is turn-based, and occurs either when a human character insists on giving you a hard time, or when you throw one of your Pokemon at a wild one. At that point, it's mostly standard fare, with each Pokemon and move having a type that is stronger or weaker against others. However, to throw a wrench into things, the game makes some significant and welcome changes. The most obvious difference is the turn order, as the speed stat doesn't just affect who moves first, but can also determine whether you or your opponent get an extra move, with certain moves like Giga Impact and Aqua Jet affecting that further. To further influence who moves next, you have strong and agile styles which allow you to either try and sneak in an extra turn at the expense of some power, or to sacrifice your speed for the sake of a more powerful hit. These then give you extra options to eke out more damage and can make enemies more threatening at the same time. Even better, the game also throws in a ton of extra stuff to ensure that you're not just sleepwalking through combat. If you anger enough wild Pokemon and enter combat, all of them will attack you at once, meaning you can't just go into combat to take them on piecemeal, you'll have to physically run away and reapproach if you want to do that. There are also occasional trainer battles that do that, but since you can't run away from those, they typically have one higher level Pokemon, and then a couple of weaker ones that are only a threat if they can leverage type effectiveness. And before you ask, moves like Swift that would otherwise hit every target on the field don't work like that here. So if you get yourself into that mess, you're just gonna have to duke it out the hard way. As another point, a lot of stat-altering moves are absent, and the ones that are present claim to affect every offensive or defensive statistic, which I would assume means both physical and special attack and defense. By my understanding, stat-altering moves were only usually relevant in multiplayer, as against the mainline game's AI, you can normally get away with every move being a damaging move. However, it ends up not being as important this time because this game doesn't have multiplayer, apart from trading and retrieving satchels from fallen trainers. Another reason for stat-altering moves being de-emphasized might be so that you can't cheese some of the more dangerous encounters. To that end, scattered throughout each map are alpha Pokemon that are bigger and a higher level relative to their surroundings, and will behave far more tactically than your average wild Pokemon. In most battles, Pokemon will do the usual choose random move from list shtick that you've likely grown used to from the mainline games. With alpha Pokemon though, if they can get type effectiveness, they'll use it. If you plan accordingly, this can lead to some amusing moments, like an Alpha Electivire that does nothing but spam their one move that can hurt a ground type. If you don't plan accordingly, don't go complaining if you bring out a grass type against a Walrein and it always chooses to use ice moves against you. Since you usually only have to contend with one alpha at a time, it's not something you're likely to lose to, especially since there's no random chance to fail at running away, but you better make sure to have a few revives ready once the fight is over. On the same note, trainer battles will operate the same way, which meant despite being a little stronger than most of my opponents, there were a lot of close scrapes. I only lost one battle due to getting surprised by a really dangerous trainer battle that I wasn't expecting or prepared for, but there were multiple times where I only had one or two Pokemon still standing by the end of it. I just wish the one time I lost didn't happen when a remix of that theme was playing. Whoever set that team up knew exactly what he was doing, and I want to shake his hand and then punch him in the face. To ensure that you're well prepared, there's been some changes to how Pokemon moves are learned and taught. You still have a place where you can teach your Pokemon certain moves, which can also be used to fast track when a move can be used with an agile or strong stance, but there's no point where a Pokemon outright forgets a move. Instead, there's a pool of moves they can switch between at any point outside of battle, allowing you to adapt your strategy to whatever you wish to take on. You can't use it as a free way to get move uses back, as the move you swapped in will be docked based on how much the prior move was used, but it's a neat way to give you some flexibility. As another quality of life improvement, evolution is now manually chosen instead of something you have to opt out of. This then means you don't have to worry about a Pokemon evolving before you finish filling out its Pokédex entry. And it means you save time that would have otherwise been spent spamming B at every moment the Pokemon would want to evolve on its own. On that note, that ties into the game's greatest strength. Given the variety of Pokemon on offer, all the collectible resources you can find, and the goals you're either given or can set for yourself, there are very few moments where you're idle. You don't have to wait to cycle through menus or for the numbers to go up on your Pokemon's experience meter. You just throw one at a tree filled with berries, go right to throwing a Pokeball at a Bidoof who was giving you the side-eye, realize a nearby Pokemon spotted you and that it'd be easier to just knock it out than run away. Then once you're done, go right back to running toward whatever objective you had in mind. There's a lot of organic storytelling that can be done with this setting. Whether it be the time you got a whole group of Pokemon mad at you, or the rare instance where a shiny Pokemon shows up. To where I'll be curious to see how many people will attempt to go full completionist or will make guest accounts on their Switch to play it again. Speaking of going full completionist though, if someone is crazy enough to try that, they'll have their work cut out for them. Along with the completed entry you get after doing 10 research tasks, there's also a marker if you complete all of the tasks. And that's before we get into what was added with the Daybreak update. There was already an option to take on named individuals at a training field, but now there are a couple of other options, such as taking on multiple consecutive opponents without an opportunity to rest, or what the game calls a Trial of Solitude, where it's one of your Pokemon versus a tailor-made challenge. Complete one of the Trials of Solitude and you get a fancy symbol in said Pokemon's Pokédex entry. So even after you have every single one, you've got reason to keep them around and see if you can't overcome whatever challenge awaits. And if you want something a little more organic, the Daybreak update also added an equivalent to the Battle Tower, where you're given a choice between 3 vague descriptions of a Pokemon, while earning points that can be used to do things like swap which Pokemon comes out first, healing a single Pokemon, or inflicting a status effect on the enemy. It's a nice way to see how long a tailor-made team can last, with the descriptions being vague enough that you're not always sure what to expect. Before the Daybreak update, the endgame was somewhat lacking, as after I completed the Pokédex, I found myself going, okay, I guess I'm done, onto the review. But with this, I've got plenty of reason to revisit the game every now and then. If there's one aspect of the game that struggles though, it's the performance. I know a lot of people have been really eager to tear this game to shreds over its graphics, especially when you look at what Zelda, Xenoblade, and Monster Hunter are capable of even on the same hardware. And yet, this might be a weird thing to say coming from a PC gamer, but graphics don't matter nearly as much as art style and performance. Graphics can certainly make a game more appealing on the outset, but simply having higher graphical fidelity doesn't make your game memorable or interesting in the long run. When it comes to art style, this game stands out a lot compared to prior entries, as there's a lot of little touches with the UI and music that are pleasing to the eye and ear. There are callbacks to Gen 4, as you would expect, but the game makes those callbacks its own, to where a friend of mine who knew nothing about Gen 4 was still able to play and enjoy the game. The environment itself could stand to be more vivid, and there are some very noticeable quality drops, such as when you're trying to catch a Pokemon in the water, but again, graphics don't matter nearly as much as performance. There's also some nice touches outside of the UI, such as snow collecting on your clothing when you're in a blizzard, and if you run into a Pokemon while they're using a move, your self-insert won't have a good time. That said, I led this part by talking about the performance, as that's where the main issues are. The one positive I can say is that the loading times are fine, at least compared to other Switch games. But now that I've said that one thing, let's go down the list. The draw distance for Pokemon and objects is surprisingly small, which is really noticeable once you're able to fly around the map, which takes away some of the fun of getting that bird's eye view. The constant texture and model pop-in is really distracting, as while it might be fine for Pokemon since you want your eyes drawn toward them, for grass and trees it's really counterproductive. And don't even get me started on the frame rate. I can live with a game that runs at 30 FPS if there's no real-time element to it, as at that point it has little bearing on how a game plays. When you throw in real-time elements though, it has a direct effect on how responsive a game is, which means it will be objectively less responsive at 30 FPS instead of 60. And if you need an example of this, go straight from this game to playing Smash Bros and tell me there isn't a difference in how responsive those two games are. They're not at all the same kind of game, so it's not fair to compare them performance-wise, but that's the kind of difference that improving the frame rate can offer. I'm already bad enough at aiming with a controller after growing up with keyboard and mouse. I don't need to be fighting the game as well as my own incompetence. If it weren't for the overly generous hitboxes on everything, I would be spending half of this video complaining about that one fact. But thankfully, I can instead complain about how that overly generous hitbox leads every tree to have a hidden Mr. Mime in it. Where this ends up mattering the most are with the Frenzied Pokemon battles. At various points in the story, you'll be tasked with quelling the frenzy of what the game calls the Noble Pokemon, which is a mode that honestly feels tacked on. The means to quell the Pokemon's frenzy is really contrived, and it's the only point where the dodge mechanic serves a crucial role, considering that at any other time, you can either bravely run away or start a Pokemon battle. There aren't that many of them, which means it's not something that grows repetitive, but it's so basic that any more of these and it would have worn out its welcome. Though, to be fair, the 5th one ended up giving me a fair amount of trouble by deciding to go full bullet hell, to where I'd consider it unironically harder than the next one. As for the final one, that was a special kind of obnoxious after not having done that minigame in a couple of weeks, as some of the patterns the opponent threw out were annoying to account for. I'm not going to show either to avoid spoilers, but since there were fights that did give me a challenge, I guess I can't complain too much. Another thing that started to wear thin was the interface, which is functional but can require more menu navigation than you might like. There aren't a whole lot of ways that this can be improved, as they're using basically every button that already exists on the controller, but there are a couple of small things that I wish were included. To start, they give us the option to switch between throwing items and throwing our Pokemon out, but once you've increased your inventory space, it can be really time consuming to keep swapping between Pokeballs, lures, and stunning items. Once you reach that state, it would be nice to have a way to quickly swap between those 3 kinds of items, especially when time is of the essence when you just stunned a Pokemon and need to throw a Pokeball before it recovers. Second, it would also be nice to have a way to look at the Pokédex entry from a Pokemon status screen. Given that a lot of Pokédex entries require you to use certain Pokemon in combat, it would be nice to see at a glance which moves we should have prepared. As it stands, I found myself constantly bouncing back and forth between the Pokédex and my list of Pokemon, just reminding myself of what I still had to complete, just for the 3 or 4 Pokemon I was carrying for that purpose. And having a way to see the specific entry for those Pokemon would be really convenient. That said, I do like how the Pokédex is laid out overall. They have specific entries for each sub-region, allowing you to see at a glance the kind of Pokemon you can find out there. For any Pokemon you've caught at least once, you'll be told where in the region they can be found, and you're able to sort by number, alphabetical order, the order in which you've encountered them, and by research level. I didn't find myself using encounter order, as after a while it all blends together in your mind, but numerical order helps remind you of evolved forms you've yet to focus on, alphabetical order is self-explanatory, and research order is useful because it shows the ones you haven't caught first, followed by ones you have and still have research tasks for. With that Pokédex in mind, let's talk about the story and setting. The first thing you're greeted by is a Pokemon called Arceus, who for whatever reason has either found or pulled your self-insert into the realm of vague exposition. After finding ourselves here, he tells us we're going to be thrown into a world filled with Pokemon, and that if we want to see him again, we are to seek out all of them. However, because we're a 15-year-old kid presumably pulled out of the modern Pokemon world, he has to first confiscate our phone before throwing us onto Prelude Beach, where we find the dock of plot convenience and the shed of on-the-nose naming conventions. I mean, we find out later that it's called that independent of our arrival, but since we don't find out the name's origin until after the credits roll, I'm contractually obligated to make fun of it. Either way, we're greeted by one professor not actually named after a tree this time, or Laventon for short, who apparently found us spat out by what he calls a rift in space-time. We find ourselves in the Hisui region, a land that, apart from the occasional settlement or camp, is overwhelmingly wilderness, at a time when humans and Pokemon still live largely separately. Since Arceus just isekai'd our characters centuries into the past, the fact that we don't show any fear or concern over the Pokemon in Professor Laventon's care gives him pause. Since that the only major settlement is Jubilife Village, we're offered a place to stay there. But given how few people there are and how dangerous the wilderness can be, we need to prove that we can carry our weight. To that end, you're put to work as part of the Survey Corps, who are tasked with going out there and learning all they can about the environments and Pokemon. As is tradition within Pokemon, however, you are not to embark on this journey alone, as you're given a choice on which Pokemon you would like to take with you. Instead of just giving you the Gen 4 starters though, Professor Laventon's travels apparently led him to encounter what we know as starters from other regions, specifically Cyndaquil from Gen 2, Oshawott from Gen 5, and Rowlet from Gen 7. Alongside your task to fill out the Pokédex, you'll also have plenty to see to within the growing Jubilife Village, fulfilling requests that will help introduce humans and Pokemon to each other, as well as resolving any trouble caused by the large space-time rift over Mount Coronet. That space-time rift is the primary driver of the story, as it also seems to be having an effect on the noble Pokemon, which is causing them to go on uncontrollable rampages. This then gives us a story reason to explore each area, which then gives us plenty of time to get to know everyone along the way. As far as the story is concerned, it's serviceable enough for the kind of game on offer. There's healthy skepticism of your sudden appearance from pretty much everyone except Professor Laventon, and there are enough conflicting motivations between each faction for there to be interesting interactions. The main source of tension might be the space-time rift, but there's also pre-existing tension between the settlers at Jubilife Village, led by the Galaxy team, and a couple of other groups called the Diamond and Pearl clans. The clans are the ones who have the best understanding of Hisui, eschewing the Pokeballs the Galaxy team favors in lieu of living alongside their Pokemon, with some being distinguished as wardens that help care for the noble Pokemon. Naturally, given the familiar names, there's also some tension between the two clans, as each one worships what they call Almighty Sinnoh, with both sides having a radically different understanding of the deity's nature. Anyone who has played Gen 4 can guess at what's going on, but for the sake of those who haven't, I'll only say that it's unclear how these diverging beliefs emerged, but that there are interesting plot points related to them, which do resolve in a satisfying way. As you would expect from all this, there are a lot of references to prior Pokemon games, in what you could call preludes to what'll exist in the modern day. Whether it be similar outfits and appearances or remixes of old music, there are so many parallels that Pokemon lore channels won't be at a loss for content as they wait for Gen 9's release. Most importantly though, knowing about those parallels doesn't take anything away from the unfamiliar, as everything holds up well enough on its own. The music isn't as prevalent as before, but as with every Pokemon game, it's really well done. Whether it be the peaceful music that plays when you're at Jubilife Village, or possibly the best remix of Spear Pillar I've heard yet, it does a really good job at setting the proper tone. There are places where the characterization is really threadbare though, as the obligatory bandits are given very little justification for why they're bandits, and are about as threatening as the anime's Team Rocket trio. But given the focus is primarily on the gameplay, having them be a potent threat alongside everything else could have taken undue focus away from where it should be. As another thing that should be mentioned, I've seen the game getting some praise for the fact that, unlike prior Pokemon games, our self-insert actually emotes for once. I'll admit that I was surprised and pleased when I saw that, especially after seeing our simple, blank expression for Sword and Shield and the Gen 4 remakes, but at the same time, is it worth commending something that should have been there before now? It's not the biggest deal when the core gameplay is the most important aspect, but when you make the kind of money that Pokemon does, I'm surprised more effort isn't put into how the characters move and emote. By my understanding, Gamefreak proper has surprisingly few staff for how successful the franchise is and for the sheer number of games they work on. And I will give them credit for improving the animations from prior games, but I'm more likely to believe that was possible because you didn't even bring in a third of the Pokemon for this one. Sure, there are differences in appearance from regional variants and within a given species, but there are still moments that make you scratch your head and wonder what they're doing. Getting back to the story, it may not have a lot of complex twists and turns, but it was an engaging one, and even threw in a couple of curveballs. I'm not going to signpost a major spoiler section since we won't be here very long, but in case you care about such things, here's a timestamp to my final thoughts. With that out of the way, the first point is a case where the setup is honestly really weak. By the time we reach the coastlands, I can think of literally one person who doesn't trust us, or who isn't at least willing to give us a chance, with that one person being someone whose opinion I don't particularly value. With that in mind, having the Galaxy team leader constantly saying how we need to ensure that we're trusted seemed really out of place, to where his unilateral decision to banish us really shouldn't have surprised me. They do give character reasons for why he would lash out like this later on, but in the moment, it effectively comes out of nowhere since he's literally the only person to act like this. Nevertheless, even with a weaker setup, everything else is solid, forcing you to slowly walk out, people staring at you as you pass, the sky's condition casting a strange glow over everything. It was really well done, and was only reinforced as everyone approaches the fallout as you would expect, with the clan leaders being hesitant to start unnecessary conflict, Laventon and your rival being upset while still wanting to help somehow, and Volo being a little too nice to where I really should have cottoned on to him sooner. It ended up being so engaging that I spent almost 4 hours straight with the game because I really wanted to know how it would resolve. As for the really impactful surprise, you have the battle with Volo. It was kind of strange at first that he kept showing up and had such a keen interest on the legends of old, a fact the game even recognized with Kajita's dialogue. But since it wasn't the first time that such a character had showed up before, I didn't think anything of it. Given his stated interest in such things, it made sense for him to be at the center of our search for Arceus, especially since Professor Laventon would be more focused on researching Pokemon directly over exploring legends about them. But then he says how he caused everything to happen by somehow empowering Giratina, all because he wanted to meet Arceus himself, to draw him out by causing enough chaos that he would have to intervene. How he would have done all of that is beyond me, but since that we had arrived to calm down Palkia and Dialga, ironically because Arceus isekai'd us here, he was then forced to resort to unleashing Giratina, which led to the most unexpected boss fight in the game. And because I walked in with 2 Pokemon that were there to fill out Pokédex entries instead of engage in main story battles, and didn't have enough max revives to keep my team alive, I was able to make it through totally not Cynthia's team, but Giratina showing up and giving me no chance to recover? Yeah, that didn't go well for me. I'm just glad that I was more prepared the second time, as otherwise I'd have a very different attitude going into it.
Now listen, Aerith, sometimes you just gotta accept the fact that you need to kill things to survive! Here, I'll show you! There! It's over! It's done! We're safe! Oh, son of a bitch!
Overall, Pokemon Legends Arceus is a welcome deviation from the norm that has ensured I'll be keeping my eye on the franchise. As much as I might have been worried about how well the core gameplay loop would keep me engaged, the events of the main story and the stellar sense of exploration easily overcame those concerns. It may have started to fall off as I neared the end of completing the Pokédex, and a lot of the characters and story beats are fairly straightforward, but if this is what future Pokemon games will look like, I will eagerly anticipate the next one, and I hope that Gamefreak learns the right lesson from this. Given that this game wasn't even out for a month before they announced Gen 9, I'm worried that that's not the case. But even if I may not find the mainline entries to be engaging, if the spin-offs continue to be this good, then I'll definitely jump on the next one when it arrives. With that said, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more reviews as well as other content posted on a semi-regular basis. As for how much I'll be talking about Pokemon now, I suspect that I won't have much to say about mainline entries, so I would hesitate to promise anything there. That said, there are a lot of spin-offs that I missed out on, like Mystery Dungeon, that might be worth exploring at some point, so we'll just have to see what the future has in store for us. In the meantime, thank you all once again for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.